to this Tuesday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Great to have you in the conversation. And again, just to close the loop on that discussion about Eric Holder, do not forget that the Constitution says that all political power, every last bit of political power, is vested in Congress. The Attorney General, the executive branch, is given absolutely no legislative power whatsoever. And so if you have an Attorney General such as Eric Holder who says, look, I cannot in good conscience defend the Constitution or the laws of the land because I don't agree with them, well, that's fine. He has the option to do that. But at that point, he immediately ought to resign his office because he's declaring to the country that I'm incapable of fulfilling the oath that I took before God to uphold and defend the laws and the Constitution of the United States. So any Attorney General, the word is out that Governor Brewer is likely to veto this thing. The pressure on her has been absolutely enormous. The Attorney General in Arizona has not even declared whether he would defend the thing if it was signed into law. So it could be another victory for Big Gay. Anyway, changing gears, I want to welcome to our decision maker line Dan Busby. Dan Busby is with the ECFA. This is an organization that provides accreditation for Christ-centered ministries. This is in the area of governance, financial management, stewardship, and fundraising. And he comes to us live from our remote studio at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Nashville. Dan, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Brian, good to be with you today.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And you know, Dan, I just came across a story that illustrated the importance of financial accountability and ethics. Now, I don't know what I did with it. Was here just a minute ago, but the pastor of the largest church in the world, Paul Yonggi-Cho in South Korea, just was convicted yesterday of embezzling $12 million from his church. And I got to guess, Dan, if that church had operated according to standards and principles of the ECFA, something like that never would have happened.
That's right. Well, that's a half a world away. If that had been a pastor here in the United States where that embezzlement occurred and sent to prison, it would send shockwaves through the church in America. And so I just had picked up on that story this morning. Very sad indeed.
Boy, it surely is, because he's been a global leader in the kingdom of God. He was one of the leaders of the house church movement. I've read books that he's written. They had enormous number of house churches as a part of his church. So they had the huge gatherings of the church on Sunday mornings, but then throughout the week they were meeting in house churches and small groups. And, you know, he set a pattern there, an example for a lot of pastors, including myself, around the globe to imitate. And now he's going to be in prison for 3 years because he failed to exercise sound, ethical, financial stewardship. You know, Don, I got to ask this question. American Family Association, we're part of the ECFA, proud and happy to be.
Yes.
We get our books audited every 3 years by an outside auditor. The IRS is usually showing up to pester us about that often. But one of the things that's very important to us is that we be able to communicate to our donors that we are being accountable for what they entrust us with. We are going to make every dollar count. We're going to make sure that they don't just have to take our word for it, that we're handling their donations in a way that's ethical and above board. How important is that for churches and organizations to do that?
Well, I think it's increasingly important as credibility on Capitol Hill and in other institutions across our country is waning. Donors are looking for trust, and the peer accountability approach that the ECFA provides brings that enhanced trust to donors. And today, nearly 1,850 churches and parachurch organizations are accredited by ECFA and follow those standards, many of which are higher than federal law requires.
Well, you know, I'm struck by something that Paul said in the epistles, where he was collecting a contribution, an offering for the poor in Jerusalem. And he said, we have regard for what is right in the sight or in the eyes of all men. Again, he was saying the same thing. When it comes to handling money, we want not only to do what is right, we want to be seen doing what is right. We want our conduct here to be so above board that anybody looking at it from the outside would have no question about the ethics of the way we are handling the finances. In fact, Paul, in that case, he wouldn't even touch the money. He had the representatives of the churches that gave donations appoint somebody from their church fellowship to actually carry the money to Jerusalem. He wouldn't touch it. He didn't disperse it. He wanted everybody to know that this was going to be used for the purposes for which it was given.
Yes, as you know, Brian, even the perception of wrongdoing often brings down a church or parachurch organization, a minister, a religious leader, and we simply can't be too careful. I spoke with a pastor of a large church the other day, and I said, this is the day to be bold in ministry and to be squeaky clean in the way we govern our organization, the way we handle our finances, and the way we handle the offerings.
Well, and you can't be too careful. I remember, Dan, even in the ministry of Christ himself, Judas was the treasurer, and he was embezzling from the gifts that were designated for the poor. So, this misuse of funds that have been entrusted to spiritual leaders, that goes back to even to the ministry of Christ. So we cannot be too careful. Now, Dan, I'm talking here with Dan Busby of the ECFA. And Dan, before we get into that, to tell us where people can get more information about the ECFA.
Yes, they can get more information at our website, www.ecfa.org. We have a very robust website with a lot of information that's helpful to churches and ministries.
ECFA.org. Now, Dan, I want to talk to you about a couple of other issues. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left here. What are some of the challenges that the church is facing right now? You monitor this thing because of the work you do. What are some of the challenges for churches right now that are coming, or for the Church of Jesus Christ that are coming from atheist groups?
Yes, our atheist friends have been quite active in challenging especially churches, and a lot of people have heard about some of the challenges, perhaps not about others. The one that is more frequently mentioned is the decision in the Western District of Wisconsin where a judge ruled that the clergy housing exclusion for ministers providing their own homes is unconstitutional. And so that has sent shockwaves through the church world. The government has stepped up and indicated that it will appeal that Wisconsin case. In fact, even just today, they asked for 30 more days. And so in early April, the government will appeal that case. And so that is one that we're certainly watching. But another atheist group out of Kentucky has filed a lawsuit also concerning the housing exclusion, but there's an element in the Kentucky case that is even more concerning to us perhaps than the Wisconsin case, because the atheists in Kentucky are challenging the exemption of churches to file the annual Form 990, a very onerous form. And I've written to Senator Charles Grassley in the past and said, if churches would have to file the Form 990 and provide the detailed information, including compensation data and much more, it would place the Internal Revenue Service into the most intimate recess of church administration, and it would be devastating in my opinion, not only causing a lot of extra work for churches, but putting investigative reporters right into the administrative area of churches. And so we're watching that Kentucky case very closely.
Well, Dan, you go back to the writings of Thomas Jefferson. He's the one that coined the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. And I agree with what Thomas Jefferson meant when he wrote those words, because what he meant, Dan, is that the Constitution erects this wall that protects the church from the interference of the state. He says the Constitution has erected that wall, a wall that separates the state from the church, so the state cannot get inside the affairs of the church and start meddling with what goes on inside the church. And if that Kentucky thing goes forward, then you're going to have the IRS right inside the walls of the church dictating a policy and making decisions that affect the life of the church, something that the Constitution and Thomas Jefferson flatly prohibits.
That's right. The First Amendment prohibits excessive entanglement between church and government, and we think that would do exactly that. And it's just simply not in the best interests of the free exercise of religion for the government to intrude into those administrative matters of churches. And so that's a real concern to us.
And when you go back, Dan, one last comment. We got about a minute and a half left. One last comment. You go back to the origin of the parsonage allowance. What this goes back to is the day when most churches provided a parsonage for the pastor. He and his family lived there. The church owned the home. They provided it to the pastor free of charge. That was part of his compensation, a place to live. The IRS said, look, you've got to declare that on your income tax as an asset or a part of your compensation. But we realize there's no income to you in that. So we're going to allow you to deduct it on another part of the tax form so that you don't have any tax liability associated with something that provides no revenue to you. Well, then churches got to the point where pastors started buying their own homes, and the IRS said, I think quite fairly, look, if the church is still providing the pastor with a way to buy a home, they might have a parsonage for one pastor, provide compensation so a pastor can provide his own home, then the same, just in the interest of fairness, the same provision ought to apply, and now that's what's at risk.
That's right. The parsonage exclusion was put into law in 1921. The exclusion was expanded in 1954 to include ministers who own their own home. And back in 21 and 54, most churches across America were very modest in size. And while we do have a number of large churches today, still the typical church that dots the landscape across America is average attendance perhaps less than 80. A very limited amount of funds, and so a change in that law would be very damaging, especially to the small churches across America.
Well, a lot of people don't understand, Dan. We got about 30 seconds up, but a lot of people don't understand that the vast majority of churches in America are small churches with less than 100 people attending.
Right.
So,
right.
And they would be definitely harmfully impacted by this thing. Our guest in our decision maker line has been Dan Busby. He's the president of the ECFA. Dan has been named one of the 50 most powerful nonprofit leaders 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013 by Nonprofit Times. Dan, thanks a lot for taking time to sit down with us for 50 minutes. Appreciate it. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Brian.
Dan Busby, president of the ECFA. You can get more information about them at ecfa.org. If you're involved in Christian ministry, Christian church, you want to make sure that the finances in your organization, your church, absolutely above board. ECFA, a terrific resource. Focal Point, AFR Talk. We'll be right back after these brief messages. Stay with us.